All right, so before we get into scoping this amplifier and reviewing the schematic, kind of want to give a little bit of history of the 102 circuit, the serial number for Robben Ford's first amplifier he got from Dumble. And a lot of this information is coming from the guys from the Amp Garage. Really good guys out there. That's kind of how I learned a lot of intricacies of Dumble and train wrecks. As best we can tell, Robben Ford got his first Dumble, which is serial number 102, in about 1982. This was originally in a black Tolex head that had Vox grill cloth on it. He later did get another one, which is around the 140 serial number, that can be seen in pictures as a green combo. That one that was in the green combo later went into the black head shell, and a tan head shell was created. 102 went into that tan head shell, and that's kind of what we see today. If you see Robben Ford, he's got the tan head shell, and it's got the green light and the green switches on it. That's the 102 amplifier. In the 90s is when Dumble came out with the, quote, Skyliner tone stack. Before then, in the 100 serial numbers, he used what the community has called the classic tone stack, which uses more typical Fender values than his previous model, which has been known as the pre-classic tone stack. Just a very interesting setup. It's a kind of a cross between Marshall and Fender. Really cool. Joe Bonamassa uses those amplifiers a lot. But it was updated in the mid-90s to the Skyliner tone stack, and you can kind of hear the difference between, say, like the Talk to Your Daughter album and like Robben Ford and the Blue Line. Hear that the mid-range is slightly different. Also, Robben used different speakers between the two albums. Talk to Your Daughter was through EVs, and later on that's when he got his Celestion G1265s that he uses and loves a lot. So that's a little bit of history. Let's get into the schematic first. All right, so we've got this schematic here provided by user KT66 off of Amp Garage. I just kind of want to go through it so that way you guys understand the schematic and where I'll be putting the scope probes as we go through the amplifier. So this is your normal input jack on the left. Down below is the FET input, which is a single field effect transistor boost stage. It was originally meant for lap steel guitars to kind of boost the output. So on this beginning stage here, we go through a single 33K resistor. What this is meant to do is kind of mimic the resistor that the 68K resistors in typical Fenders would give you. Sometimes in Dumbles it's a 22, but in this 102 schematic it's 33. So then we go into the first 12AX7 stage, where the plate resistor is a 220K, the cathode resistor is 3.3K, with a 5 UF bypass cap on there. Now the plate resistor, the higher in value you go, the more gain you have. What I mean by gain is not necessarily distortion, although it can lead to it, but output. Gain, how much voltage gain are you getting out of the stage? So 220K is a pretty large value for a plate resistor. Also darkens up the sound a little bit. 3.3K. One thing you'll also notice about the plate and cathode resistor values is that there's this 66.6 repeating to 1 ratio of resistors that Dumble would use. Kind of mimics the 100K, 1.5K that were found in the Dumble, quote, low plate amplifiers, as the community has kind of named it. The ones that use like the 220K and we'll see the 150K as the high plate. And then the 5 UF bypass capacitor. So that's a smaller value than what Fender typically used, but still larger than what you would see in a Marshall with like that 0.68 UF one. I find this is a really good value to use in a lot of guitar amplifiers where you're not stepping on the bass player's toes with the low frequencies, and you're not cutting off the fundamental of the low E string. Now it feeds out of here into the tone stack, and this tone stack looks like a mess but let me see if I can simplify it for you. So this is the path up here for the treble frequencies. Has a 0.002 UF cap in series with this 390 picofarad cap. Now this 390 picofarad cap is part of this mid-boost circuit. So when the mid-boost is off, those two capacitors are in series. And when it's on, it shorts out the 290 picofarad cap, and you're just left with this 0.002. So when these are in series, the value becomes 326 picofarads. Bit higher than most Fenders at that 250 picofarad, but lower than the 500 found in Marshall, so kind of in the middle. Then it goes through a 250K linear taper pot, as listed here. Has a 150K slope resistor. Now this slope resistor kind of dictates the high to mid and base ratio. The higher in value the slope resistor is, the less mids and bass you will have. So Marshall on the super leads was a 33K. On the super basses and basemans was like a 56K, and Fenders were typically a 100K. So that was one of the things. In addition, this has been known in the community as a Skyliner tone stack, supposedly because that's how it looks on a scope. So then we have a 0.1 UF bass cap, kind of a typical Fender value. Goes into a 500K pot that, quote, was measured 400K. So that value helps to determine things. Has this 0.01 UF cap around the bass control, so it kind of acts like a notch filter and filters out some upper mids, if you will. And then a 10K limiting resistor. So even if you turn the bass knob all the way off, you still have about 10K resistance keeping it from going completely to the ground. Similar to how like the 6.8K mid resistor in Fender amplifiers acts. Then the mid control, if you notice, is separate from the bass. It's not together like a Fender would be. It's got a 0.01 UF mids cap, which is higher than both a Fender and a Marshall, with a 250K mid control in there. So the Rock Jazz, all it's doing is adding a resistor and a capacitor to it to kind of act like a bandpass filter, if you will, where it's knocking off the lows and the highs to kind of give that jazzy tone. And then this labeled here is the PAB, is the preamp boost. What that's doing is disconnecting the treble pot from the bass pot. And it really acts as if you turned the treble and bass knobs all the way up. However, the mid control is not part of that. If you see, the signal flow comes out of the tube through the 150K resistor, through the 0.01 cap, down to the potentiometer. So it's unaffected by that. So that's kind of an interesting note. So after it goes, through this tone stack, comes out of the treble cap, goes through typical 1 meg volume pot, bright cap. Rarely see people use the bright switch on the Dumble. Then it kind of comes through this unique network here before it hits the second gain stage. The grid stopper here is a 220K with a 500 picofarad cap around it. I kind of think of this as more of a bright cap. Some people call it a treble peaking cap. But what the 220K does is that it will bring a lot of the signal down in level, and the 500 picofarad cap allows a lot of the highs to bypass that. So you do get this kind of an increase, and it's something I'll kind of show when we're scoping things out. The network after it with the 10 meg resistors and the 0.05 cap, that's what's called local negative feedback. You may hear someone talk about negative feedback in an amplifier. Typically they're referring to global negative feedback, which is in the power section. This is local. So the plate and the grid of the tube are out of phase with each other. This is sending some signal from the plate back into the grid to kind of level things off and keep it from distorting. Kind of weird to think that, in the Overdrive special, you want less distortion. But you gotta remember, it's got a clean channel, and this amp really to me is all about gradually increasing the gain to where you get that nice smooth overdrive, as opposed to like the buzziness that you get with something like a triple rec or the PV triplex I just had. So then the next stage is a 150K plate resistor, 0.22 cathode resistor with a 5 UF cap bypassing that. So something else about Dumble schematics that I've seen is that it's typically the first stage has the higher plate and cathode resistors. The second stage will have lower. So in this case, it's 220K and then 150K for the second stage. Kind of can help with some asymmetrical distortion. So then it goes through this 0.047 coupling cap to block the DC and just let the AC pass. Then it goes into another relay. Now this relay either sends the clean channel to the master to go to the output, or it sends it into overdrive. So let's assume that it's in the overdrive mode, and we'll get back to the master. So it comes into this and this is the internal trim pot. That is one of the things that was tuned to the player's preferences. Goes through this little network and ends up going through another gain stage with a 220K plate resistor and a 3.3K cathode resistor, 5 UF cap. Notice this amplifier uses all 5 UF caps. It has this little ceramic disc capacitor that goes between the plate and the cathode. Now, like the previous local negative feedback, where it went plate the grid, this goes plate the cathode. Same kind of concept. The plate is out of phase with the cathode, so this way it helps tame some of the high end, smooth things out, and can also prevent oscillation. Now, one of the things that starts to happening is we start decreasing the coupling cap size. Out of the clean section, we had a 0.047. Now, out of this stage, we got a 0.01. So we're cutting some of the bass off. And then it goes through a 100K resistor. So that's limiting the signal down, but it's also going to trim some of the highs off. So we're starting to kind of shape this, I call it like a bandpass filter, where you're knocking the highs and the lows off, and where you're focusing more on the mids. After that, we have this 100K linear drive control. It comes out 180K grid stopper, so that's going to knock some of the high end off. Goes through a 150K plate resistor, 2.2K cathode resistor, and same little 250K snubber cap here to help the highs, and then a 0.005 coupling cap. Now, that's still larger than like your Marshall Super Lead 0.022 cap, but we're again going through this 150K resistor, so as we're stepping up in gain, we're cutting bass and cutting the highs so that we're not getting a flubby tone and we're not getting this ear-piercing stuff that can happen as well. So that is one of the unique things about this circuit, as opposed to just tacking on more gain stages. We're being thoughtful about how we're controlling the highs and the lows and building up that mid frequency that makes a good lead sound. Then we've got this ratio pot here. This is kind of a master volume for the lead channel. You have to kind of play with the ratio to kind of balance it out with the cleans channel. So then we go through this master volume here, then send the return jacks. Case with us, we'll be going through the external tube buffered effects loop. Then we go down to the phase inverter, which is somewhat similar to a Fender and a Marshall, kind of a unique combination. You got a 0.02 cap coming in, so that's like a Marshall. Then we've got an present circuit is a 2K pot with a 2.2 UF presence cap, which is pretty large for a presence cap. Most of the time you'll see like a 0.1 or a 0.68 in some Marshalls, but this is 2.2. So it's getting into the mid-range of the amplifier as well. To me, what the thought process here was kind of correcting the biasing of this tube for use with a 12AX7 versus a 12AT7. Because some of this is very similar values to what you would find in like an AB763 Fender, but this 820 ohm resistor is pretty much double the 470 that you would typically find. And then the plate resistors here are also increased from the typical 100K, 820K. Again, that will help increase the gain of this and smooth off some of the highs. This also has a 10K balancing potentiometer in here, where you can balance the two triodes. That's one of the reasons why with an amplifier with negative feedback, the plate resistors will rarely match. It's because one will be weaker than the other because of the negative feedback. So you compensate for that with the side with the negative feedback has the higher value plate resistor. So then we go through some 0.1 UF coupling caps to the output, typical Fender type values. Bias comes in near typical 22K grid leak resistors here. Then it uses 5.1K grid stoppers on the 6L6s, closer to Marshall than Fender. Marshall used 5.6, 5.1 in some cases, I think. Fender typically used 1.5. Then also Trainwreck used 1.5. Kingfisher did. Then we've got 470 ohm screen resistors on all the tubes, very typical for 6L6s. Then the half power switch down here is kind of unique, where it doesn't fully disconnect it from ground, but it runs it through these 10K resistors and an LED. So it creates a voltage to run the LED to let you know that you're in 50 watt mode, but it doesn't fully remove them out of circuit, which is kind of unique. Then you have your typical output transformer from Fender Twin there. Now there's the power section here. This is the power transformer. You've also got your low voltage here for the switching, Radio Shack transformer, regulator, and then out to your relays and such. So this uses just a regular Fender transformer. This is typically what most people use. Robben Ford's was believed to be one of the tone masters. One of the reasons for that was the adjustability for the input voltage, so being able to take it in different countries and such. This schematic here has it with the 60 volt tap coming out for your bias, kind of a typical Fender arrangement here. Filament down here with your artificial center tap of your two 100 ohm resistors, and a LED to let you know that the amplifier is on. So your first filter node here is two 220 UF capacitors in series. So when you put capacitors in series of equal values, you just half it but double the voltage. So this ends up being 110 UF at 700 volts. More than enough voltage, and that's one thing that Dumble did play with a lot of his amplifiers was the first node filtering. It typically followed the wattage of the amplifier. So this is a quote 100 watt amplifier, and you see we've got about 100 UF of filtering on here. A lot of the 50 watts that I've seen have, instead of 220 here would be 100s. So 50 UF of filtering. And some of the EL34s, which would typically be a little bit higher wattage, would have about 130 or so UF. Move through that, standby switch through a twin reverb filter choke. And then you have all your dropping resistors here. 2.7K, 22K, 2.2K. And this has it listed with the last two filters being at 40 microfarads each. I don't believe that's true. I think both of these are actually 20. I haven't updated in mind, but I think that this one for the screen is actually a lot closer to 35 or 40. Just kind of some stuff I've seen. Also, with the schematic, there's kind of a debate whether this resistor coming out of the overdrive section is a 150K or a 180K. Some people say it's 180K and they have it on good knowledge. Might be something to try in the future. But mine has the 150K right now. All right, so enough looking at the schematic. Let's get into the amplifier. So before we begin, one thing I want to note real quick is that what I am doing here is highly dangerous. Please do not attempt this. This is an open amplifier with greater than 400 volts. This will leave burnt entry and exit wounds if you touch it incorrectly, or in fact kill you. So please do not attempt what I am doing here. All right, now to show this amplifier off a little bit, we've got all original 60s Fender Twin reverb transformers and choke. So the power transformer and output transformer and the choke are all from an original blackface Fender amplifier. Robben Ford's amplifier, the power transformer is, from a Red Knob or Tone Master, one of the 80s amplifiers, mainly for the different international voltages. So that's one difference with this amplifier. Now looking at the preamp circuit board, you can see it's got all vintage orange drops. Now getting into the measurements of the amplifier, one thing I'm going to do is I am going to show all of the graphs from it, but I've also got playing tests with each of the different settings and configurations of the amplifier. So that way we can kind of correlate the graphs we're seeing to the sound we're hearing. Since YouTube may not be the best for conveying just the audio across, but you'll be able to kind of see how as different frequencies go up and down and such, kind of help correlate that with audio. All right, so the first one we have here is on the clean section with the EQ set flat. And for all of the clean section ones, I'm taking the measurement after that 0.047 capacitor coming out of the clean section. So before it would hit the master volume or go to the overdrive section. And the input is going straight into the front of the amplifier. So just like a guitar, would go into it. So with the EQ set flat, it's got a pretty flat curve from about 44 hertz to 2.7 kilohertz. And those points are what's called the 3 dB roll off. So that's a good measurement because at that point it's technically half power. So like a 100 watt Marshall versus 50 watt Marshall. A 50 watt Marshall is 3 dB lower than a 100 watt Marshall. So this is just kind of a baseline if you were to set the EQ flat, but no one does that. So let's look at if you take the treble and turn it all the way up. So with the treble all the way up, it peaks at 3.75 kilohertz and is pretty responsive between 1.3 kilohertz and 11 kilohertz, so pretty high up there. One other thing to note is that as you turn the treble knob, it actually shifts the frequency peak in and around, and we'll kind of see that when we start adding things together. So let's move on to the mid control, turned all the way up to 10. So with that, the peak is about 2.6K, and the 3 dB roll-offs are 155 hertz to 12 kilohertz. So pretty wide frequency range there. Let's take a look at the bass now. So the bass, the 3 dB points are basically zero. It'll go all the way down to 173 kilohertz and peaks at about 60 hertz. Now, one thing to note about frequencies to kind of correlate it to notes on your electric guitar is the low E string is tuned to 82 hertz. The high E string is 330 hertz, and then the high E string on the octave, the 12th fret, is 660 hertz. So that kind of helps you kind of correlate where these frequencies, when I'm just calling out numbers, approximate notes, what they are on the electric guitar. So now that we've kind of gone through those frequencies, let's set everything to, Robben Fordish kind of EQ curve here and see how that looks. So with the EQ kind of set how, Robben Ford sets his, and, he changes his settings night to night depending upon the stage. We've got a boost at 82 hertz, a dip at 375 hertz, and then a little treble increase at 2.8 kilohertz. Now again, it's kind of interesting that the bass peak down there is right at the low E string of the electric guitar. And at 375 hertz, even though with the value that you see in the Dumble amplifier, you would think the mid frequency range would be a lot higher versus what the Fender is with the larger value cap. but because it's a function of the potentiometer value and the capacitor value, it actually equals about what a Fender AB763 would be as far as the mid dip. Then 2.8 kilohertz for your treble peak. Gives you a nice shimmer top end on there without being too ear piercing. So we've got that not stepping on the bass player's toes with a whole bunch of low end, mid dip around where typical vocal range is, and then kind of the shimmer on top to kind of help it cut through. So let's experiment with some of the other switches that you can use for tone shaping. Let's go for the mid switch. So with the mid switch, your 3 dB points is 175 hertz all the way up to 6 kilohertz with a peak at about 1.55 kilohertz. So kind of peaking in around the most active part of the human hearing range, and pretty wide spectrum there. So now let's go from the rock position, which all these have been in, to the jazz position and kind of see what we get from there. So we're cutting a lot of frequencies kind of off in the low end. Kind of peaks at about 44 hertz, dips down at 175 hertz, and then peaks back again at 3.5K. Kind of an interesting setting. You can kind of hear that in the playing example as well. So now let's set everything back to kind of a Robben Ford setting, and let's see what the preamp boost does. So as you can hear with the preamp boost, a lot higher of a signal kind of comes out. So your 3 dB points are 400 hertz up to 7.7 kilohertz. So pretty wide range there. Pretty flat. Peaks at about 2 kilohertz. It really is, lifting the preamp. It's disconnecting the tone stack out of the equation, basically. So that kind of comes in important when you're doing like solo boost, where instead of having that mid dip, it brings the mids back up so you can kind of cut through the mix. So that's the clean section. So now let's move on to the overdrive section. Now in the overdrive section, it's still the same, where I'm going into the input jack like a guitar would, but now I'm taking the measurement after the 150K resistor in the overdrive section. So let's see how the overdrive section plays with the clean section. We've got that kind of big mid shelf in there, and the 3 dB points are 93 hertz up to 5.6 kilohertz with a peak at about 1K. So pretty much exactly what you would want for soloing leads and such like that, to where you're again not stepping on the bass player's toes, kind of rolling things off past the 100 hertz or so, and then 5.6K. Once you start getting beyond that, you start getting into some like really weird ear piercing kind of type stuff, except if it's harmonics and controlled properly, which we'll see a little bit later. And at 1 kilohertz, that's right at the optimal range for human hearing. So very thoughtfully designed. So now let's add the preamp boost and kind of see how it behaves. So adding the preamp boost to overdrive, kind of very similar. Still your 3 dB points are 93 hertz up to 5.6K, so not really adding much there. But the peak shifts down a little bit, down to 750 hertz. Kind of interesting. You can kind of hear that in the playing example, where it gets a little bit more honky, if you will. Very interesting. So let's move on to the power section and look at how the presence control is affecting things. I'm injecting signal into the 0.02 coupling cap going into the phase inverter, and taking my output measurement straight out of the back of the amplifier as if a speaker were hooked up. So the presence all the way down, the response is basically flat. There's no real 3 dB roll off in the human hearing range. Kind of what you would expect. The Dumble amplifiers are mainly about preamp distortion and such, not power amp distortion like say a Trainwreck or a Marshall's kind of going after. If we turn the presence control all the way up, let's see how that affects the tonality. So the presence control all the way up, you can see it's really boosting from about 100 hertz up. That's because the 102 schematic, Robben Ford amplifier from what we've all seen, has a pretty large 2.2 microfarad capacitor in there. Marshall would be like a 0.1 or 0.68. That 2.2 value is really getting down into the lower mids and boosting that up. But again, that's right in the range that electric guitar sits. 100 hertz and up, good place to be. Some kind of interesting things that we can also take a look at is exactly what is the overdrive section doing. We can isolate it where I can inject signal to the input of the overdrive stage, which is the stage that gets added to the clean section, and then take the measurement like I did before right after that 150K resistor, see how it's shaping things and seeing if what I talked about before of cutting bass and cutting highs really is happening. So as you can see, we've kind of got this, called a parabolic shape, if you will, where its peak is about 700 hertz, and then your 3 dB points is 130 hertz up to 3.45 kilohertz. So right in the proper range for electric guitar, peaking at the proper point to kind of fill out the mid-range. So again, very well thought out, and that's kind of one of the things that lends itself to being such a great amplifier. So let's see if the external effects loop is, adding anything to it. All right, so now looking at the frequency plot of the standalone effects loop, it's mostly flat down low, which is kind of what you would want out of this, but it does kind of peak up in the real extremes, up and around 15 kilohertz or such. The reason for this is that I'm using the bright cap to overcome the long cables that I'm using for this. That's kind of part of the Robben Ford deal, is you need the external effects loop and you need long cables running from the amplifier to the effects loop to kind of help knock out some of the high end, but you're also adding it back in. It's all of these frequency curves that kind of stack on top of each other to produce the final sound. So let's look at the final sound that comes out of the amplifier with the different gain configurations. Now what I'm doing is I'm injecting signal into the input jack and then taking the output straight out of the back. So we're running through, the preamp, the external effects loop, power amp, so it's all working together. So we can see exactly what's happening. And I've got one of the bright switches on the effects loop, which you've actually been hearing in the playing examples. And I'll replay the examples so you can kind of correlate, these overall graphs with what you're hearing again. So let's see the clean channel. So with the clean channel, with everything working together and everything kind of set to how Robben Ford sets his, we've got a bass boost at about 85 hertz. So again, that low E string. Dip in the mids at 450 hertz. Again, very Fenderish kind of place to be. And then it kind of peaks again at 6.7K. So that's kind of the bright cap where I'm trying to overcome some of the loss of the longer cables that I'm using with the effects loop. Nothing shrill. That high end really allows for the upper harmonics to kind of come through. Speaking of those harmonics, one thing I've also done is taken, it's called fast Fourier transformation. So what you're able to do is see the harmonic content. So I've got a 1 kilohertz signal going in, which is kind of the first peak you see. And then you can see at 2K, it's got a pretty high peak, and then 3, 4, and 5K, those peaks are a little less. So that second order harmonic, which is actually the octave, really is kind of standing out. And that lends to a nice, good, quote, tube sound for a guitar amplifier. And I also looked at the waveform just to see exactly how clean it is. Waveform's very clean. In fact, one thing I did was kind of look at the input voltage kind of going into the amplifier versus the harmonic distortion. And all the way up to about 50 watts, which actually I had this on the 50 watt setting. This thing's under 2% harmonic distortion. The clean setting on half power, you could throw EMGs on this and it's still going to be a very clean signal that, frankly, a lot of hi-fi amplifiers can't do that. Very interesting to see. Now let's look at the preamp boost being added to the clean section and seeing how that sounds and looks. So now with the preamp boost added, we've kind of got a peak at about 900 hertz. Then it kind of dips down a little bit at 3.3K, and then it kind of picks back up at 7.6K. Very mid-rangey, cutting off a lot of low end. Again, not stepping on the bass player's toes. And is almost a flat response. It's pretty interesting to see how the presence control interacts, where it's boosting the high end. So again, I did the fast Fourier transformation so we can look at the harmonic content. Pretty similar to the clean section where the second order is the most predominant, then the third, fourth, fifth order and such have come up a little bit, but all the upper harmonics are still pretty low. Let's now look at the overdrive section without the preamp boost and see how that's looking. Now with the overdrive section, got a pretty flat curve with the 3 dB points being 68 hertz and 3.2 kilohertz, and the mid peak is actually about 260 hertz. Pretty interesting. It's kind of as you would expect, all that mid range, allowing you to cut through the mix, get those nice singing lead tones out of it. And looking at the fast Fourier transformation of it, we've got a lot more harmonic content. It's got a lot of even and odd order harmonics in it. In fact, the odd order harmonics are a little bit higher in some areas than the even, and sometimes the evens are a little bit higher than the odds. Very interesting. Kind of helps lead to a good sounding amplifier. And looking at the waveform output, we've kind of got a combination of a semi-square and a sawtooth, where like the bottom part of the waveform is almost a sawtooth and the top part is trying to become a square. Got a little bit of an overshoot on the front end, but that overshoot is kind of your higher frequencies, and it makes the amplifier sound lively when that happens. Very interesting to see the waveform on here, and that's what happens when you start adding the harmonic contents, because technically a square wave is all of the harmonics evenly distributed. So now let's add the preamp boost to it. So with the preamp boost added, we've now got a 3 dB roll-off points of 84 hertz and 2.5 kilohertz with a peak at about 315 hertz. So still wide mid-range, but not boosting anything below the fundamental low E string of the electric guitar. Not really boosting too much of anything well beyond things that get in the ice picky and making your ears hurt and bleed. Looking at the fast Fourier transformation, very similar to just the overdrive by itself. More harmonic content kind of coming out. And looking at the waveform of it, very similar to just the overdrive channel, where the bottom is kind of turning into a sawtooth. The top is now even kind of becoming more of a square wave, where the trailing edge is coming down and starting to flatten out. Kind of be expected when you've got this much gain going on in an amplifier. So that kind of wraps it up for everything. I'd like to thank y'all for staying with me through this. If there's anything additional you guys would like to see or for me to kind of go over, I don't mind doing a part 2. If you've got other amplifiers that you would like to see this done with, comment it down below. And always like and subscribe, share as much as possible. So thank y'all.